The morning after my husband's funeral, I found out I had been married for 40 years and owned almost nothing at all. I was still wearing the same black dress I had fallen asleep in. My coffee had gone cold on the kitchen table, and sympathy lilies were already starting to brown around the edges. I remember standing at the sink with my hand wrapped around a chipped mug, staring at a stack of envelopes I had never thought to fear. By noon, I knew the checking account had been nearly emptied. The house was not protected the way he had always promised, and there were pieces of my own life that had been arranged without me. Grief is a strange thing. It makes the room feel both too small and too large, and in that hollow silence, I began to understand that my husband had left behind more than sorrow. My name is Elaine Mercer. I was 63 years old when Harold died, and until that week, I would have told anyone that ours had been a steady marriage. Not glamorous, not the kind people write songs about, but steady in the way I thought mattered more. We had been the sort of couple who could sit in the same room for an hour without speaking and still feel companionable. He liked the newspaper folded into exact quarters. I liked the radio low while I washed dishes. He took his coffee black and too hot. I always let mine cool, then forgot where I set it down. We married when I was 23 and he was 27. Harold worked in commercial heating and air for most of his life, and I spent almost 30 years as a receptionist at a paediatric clinic before arthritis in my hands made the long hours difficult. We raised one son, Daniel, in a 3-bedroom brick house just outside Macon, with azalea bushes out front and a back porch Harold kept promising to repair properly one day. He was a man of postponed projects, half-finished shelves in the garage, a loose kitchen drawer he always said he would get to on Saturday, tools arranged in careful rows as if organisation itself were a form of progress. He had a quiet competence that impressed people. That was one of the things I loved about him in the beginning. He did not talk big. He did not charm a room. He simply handled things. If the car made a sound, Harold listened. If the water bill looked high, Harold called. If tax season came, Harold sat at the dining room table with his reading glasses low on his nose and a sharpened pencil behind his ear. And I would bring him toast or soup or whatever the hour called for. Somewhere inside that division of labour, a habit formed so slowly I never saw it for what it was. He handled the money, I handled the life around it. At the time, it felt natural. There are so many things women of my generation were taught to call trust when they were really just absence. Absence of access, absence of questions, absence of our own names on paper. But I did not know that yet. Not fully. Not the morning after the funeral, when my sister-in-law was still arranging casseroles in my refrigerator, like grief could be stacked neatly in foil pans. Her name is Francine. She is Harold's younger sister by 5 years, with a hard little voice that always sounds as though she is on the edge of correcting someone. Even as a girl, according to family stories, she had been sharp, observant, the one who remembered who owed what and who said what at Christmas 3 years earlier. I had spent 4 decades learning how to take her in small doses. She loved Harold in the possessive way some sisters do, as if marriage were a long loan rather than a change in the shape of a man's life. That morning she was in my kitchen wearing beige slacks and a church cardigan, opening cabinets that were not hers to open. "You need to eat something," she said, lifting the lid off a dish from Mrs. Colton down the street. "At your age, you can't just sit around on coffee." At your age, Francine was 58. "I'm fine," I said. She looked at me the way people do when they have already decided you are not capable of understanding your own condition. Well, fine or not, there are things that need attention. There was something in her tone that made me put my mug down. "What things?" She dabbed at the corner of the countertop with a paper towel that did not need using. "Accounts, paperwork." Harold was always very organised. I'm sure he left things in order. I should have noticed then that she said it too quickly, like a line rehearsed in the car. But grief dulls your instincts at first. You think everyone's oddness belongs to mourning. By mid-morning, Daniel came by after dropping his girls at school. My son was 38 then, broad-shouldered like his father, already going silver at the temples, with the same habit of tugging once at his wedding band when he felt cornered. He kissed my cheek, asked how I slept, then stood in the living room staring at the sympathy cards lined across the mantel, as if they might tell him how to behave. His wife Tessa had gone back to work. Daniel said the girls had cried at breakfast because they missed Grandad's Sunday pancakes. And for one brief moment, my sorrow softened into something almost bearable. Harold had loved making those pancakes. He never flipped them cleanly. Batter always landed somewhere it should not. The kitchen would smell like butter and coffee and that sweet vanilla mix he used, even though he claimed he was following the recipe exactly. I looked at Daniel and thought, this is what remains. Children, memory, the shape of someone in the habits they leave behind. Then he cleared his throat and asked, too casually, "Did you call the bank yet?" I turned toward him slowly. "No, I was going to do it this afternoon." He nodded once. Good. Good. There was a pause then, one of those small pauses that means more than a speech. Francine looked down at the foil pan. Daniel adjusted his wedding band. I felt something cool pass through me. Why? I asked. No reason, he said. Just figured you'd want to know where everything stands. Everything. That word sat between us like a closed door. I told myself not to be dramatic. My husband had been dead 3 days. Of course there was paperwork. Of course there were accounts and transfers and forms. Death is administrative in ways no one tells you beforehand. It drags clipboards and envelopes into the room before your body has even accepted the loss. Still, after they left, I called the bank. I remember every detail of that conversation because my life divided itself there without warning. The woman on the phone was polite, soft-spoken, maybe in her 40s. She offered condolences in a practiced voice, then asked for my identification details and the last 4 digits of the account number. I had those written on a notepad Harold kept in the drawer beside the refrigerator, the one where he also kept rubber bands and church bulletins and pens that worked only every other try. I expected inconvenience, a temporary hold, instructions. What I did not expect was confusion. I'm sorry, she said after a pause. Can you repeat your name? Elaine Mercer. Another pause. Keyboard taps. Mrs. Mercer, I'm only seeing one active personal checking account associated with Mr. Harold Mercer, and it appears the balance was substantially reduced 10 days ago. Reduced how? A longer silence. There was a transfer. To where? I'm not able to discuss the destination of the transfer unless you are listed as an authorised account holder. I gripped the phone tighter. I'm his wife. Yes, ma'am, I understand, but I'm not seeing your name on the account. The room seemed to tilt just slightly. Not enough to make me fall, only enough to let me know the ground had changed. That can't be right, I said. I've used that account for years. You may have used the debit card attached to the account, but from what I can see, the account is solely in Mr. Mercer's name. Solely. Such a small, clean word for something that tears through a person. I sat down at the kitchen table without meaning to. The chair made that scraping sound Harold hated. My hand was trembling now, and I pressed it flat against my thigh so the woman on the phone would not hear it in my voice. What is the balance? She told me. I thought she must have missed a number. That's not possible. I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer. No one tells you how humiliating confusion can be. People speak of betrayal as anger, heartbreak, shouting. But before any of that, there is humiliation, a private shrinking. The terrible feeling of being a woman in her 60s, discovering that the life she managed every day was built on information she was never granted. I thanked her. I do not know why I thanked her. Then I hung up and sat there listening to the clock above the stove tick loud enough to seem rude. The house was too still. Funeral flowers in the living room. Harold's slippers still beside the bed. His reading glasses on the side table. A life interrupted, yes. But also, I was beginning to realise, a life curated, managed, edited. I pulled open the drawer beside the refrigerator and took out the notepad again. There were account numbers in Harold's square handwriting, service passwords written in abbreviations only he could decode, a list of medicines from his last cardiology appointment, and a reminder to call someone named Ray about gutters. Nothing alarming, nothing useful. Just enough to remind me how thoroughly he had arranged himself between me and every practical part of our life. I spent the next hour going through the file cabinet in the hall. Insurance policies, car titles, utility bills, tax returns clipped in yearly bundles. Harold loved order, but it was his kind of order. Things filed under names that made sense only to him. Home, health, auto, miscellaneous, important, very important. I found old warranties for appliances we no longer owned. I found the deed to the cemetery plot he bought after his first heart scare. I found Daniel's middle school report card because Harold once said it had been worth keeping. What I did not find was any clear explanation for where our money had gone. By late afternoon, my back ached and my eyes burned. I had one small pile of documents that worried me, and one larger pile of documents I did not understand. I also had a growing sense that Francine knew far more than she had any right to know. That evening, she came back with a peach pie from church and let herself in without knocking. "I brought dessert," she said, then stopped when she saw the papers spread across the dining room table. "What are you doing?" I looked up at her. "Trying to understand my own finances." Her expression shifted so quickly, most people would have missed it. Irritation first, then caution. Then that brittle softness people use when they want to calm someone they do not respect. "You shouldn't tire yourself out with this tonight." "I called the bank." She set the pie down. "And?" "There was a transfer. Most of the checking account is gone." She folded her arms. "Well, Harold must have had his reasons." I stared at her. My husband had not even been buried 48 hours when his sister said those words in my kitchen. "His reasons," I repeated. She gave the smallest shrug. "You know how Harold was." He thought ahead. "No," I said, more sharply than I intended. Apparently, I did not know how Harold was. For the first time, she looked unsettled. She glanced towards the window, then back at me, her mouth tightening around something unspoken. And there it was again, that sensation of standing in a room where a conversation had begun before I arrived. "Francine," I said quietly, "what aren't you telling me?" She let out a breath through her nose. "I'm not doing this with you while you're emotional." I laughed then, once, because there are moments when a person becomes so insulting that laughter is the only dignified response. "I'm emotional because my husband just died. I'm asking because my name isn't on the account I thought was ours." She picked imaginary lint off her cardigan sleeve. "Harold took care of things the way he saw fit. That's all I know." It was a lie. Not a dramatic lie, not a flamboyant one, just a flat lie, spoken by a woman who believed she could outlast my questions. I looked at her hands. Francine had a habit when she was concealing something of rubbing the side of her thumb against her ring finger. She was doing it now. "I want whatever you know," I said, "and I want it tonight." Her chin lifted. "You're not the only one who lost him." Such a clever sentence, so clean, so ready-made for moral defense. It almost worked. But beneath the grief, beneath the shock and administrative panic, something older in me had begun to wake up. A woman can spend years smoothing a household, taking the softer chair, letting louder people set the tone. But once she feels the shape of deliberate exclusion, something in her steadies. Not all at once, not like thunder, more like a match being struck in a dark pantry. "You're right," I said. "I'm not the only one who lost him. I'm just the one who shared a bed with him for 40 years and has to live with what he left behind." Her eyes hardened. Then she said something I would replay in my mind for weeks. "You may not want to dig into every corner of a marriage this long, Elaine. Some arrangements were made a long time ago." Arrangements. The word landed in the center of the room and seemed to stay there. I stood up slowly. My knees felt weak, but my voice did not. "What arrangements?" She looked almost angry with herself for saying too much. I said what I said. "No, you came into my house after my husband died, and you talked around me like I was a child. You do not get to leave now with half a sentence." She picked up her purse. "Call Daniel if you need help with bills." That was when I knew two things for certain. First, she knew. Second, Daniel knew something too. After she left, I locked the front door and went back to the file cabinet with a different mind. Not grieving wife now, not yet widowed and stunned. I was a woman being lied to inside her own life. I opened every drawer. I checked the backs of folders, old manila envelopes, the locked metal box in the hall closet where Harold kept passports and birth certificates. I found a second insurance policy I had never seen before, payable not to me, but to a trust, with a name that meant nothing to me. Mercer Family Holding Trust. I said the words out loud just to hear how absurd they sounded in my mouth. Then, tucked inside an envelope marked Property Taxes 2014, I found a folded slip of paper no larger than a receipt. It had an address on it. Not ours. Not any address I recognised. A house number, a county road, and the name of a town about 40 minutes away. On the back, in Harold's handwriting, were 4 words. "Keep current, don't mention." I sat there at the dining table until the kitchen went dark around me, that little slip of paper between my fingers, listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock tick and my own breathing turn shallow. For 40 years, I had thought the secrets in a marriage would be the ordinary kind, unspoken resentments, regrets, a few private disappointments, the sort of things time folds into companionship. But that address told me I was looking at something else entirely. And for the first time since Harold died, I was no longer afraid only of being alone. I was afraid of what I was about to find. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the dining room table in my robe with Harold's reading lamp turned toward the slip of paper, as if a brighter bulb might change what it said. Keep current. Don't mention. I must have read those 4 words 100 times, each time hearing them in his voice, low and matter-of-fact. The same voice he used when reminding me to rotate the tyres or check the batteries in the smoke detector. There was no apology in it, no hesitation, just instruction. Just a man speaking to himself, or to someone who already understood. Around 2 in the morning, I made toast I did not want and stood at the kitchen counter chewing with no appetite, staring out at the yard. The porch light caught the edge of the azalea bushes, and beyond them everything was black and still. This had always been the hour when Harold slept the hardest. He used to lie on his back with one hand on his stomach, his mouth barely open, breathing in soft little bursts that sometimes annoyed me when I could not settle. I had spent years beside that body, learning the sound of him in sleep, the weight of him in a mattress, the particular smell of his neck after a summer day outside. It is hard to explain what betrayal does when it arrives after death. If a living person deceives you, you can throw a glass, slam a door, demand an answer. But when the person is gone, all that anger has nowhere clean to go. It stays inside the rooms. It stains objects. It makes a widow look at a folded jacket or a favourite chair and feel ambushed. By morning, I had decided 2 things. I would not tell Daniel about the address yet, and I would not cry again until I understood what I was crying over. At 9:15, I called the county assessor's office for the town on the note. My voice sounded steady, almost pleasant, which surprised me. Years of reception work had trained me to sound calm even when I was one sentence away from collapse. The woman who answered had a thick South Georgia accent and the slow, unbothered rhythm of someone who had never once apologized for a hold time in her life. I gave her the address. She asked me to wait. I could hear papers moving, keyboard taps, someone in the background laughing about a church raffle. Then she came back on the line and read the property parcel number, the lot description, and the name attached to the tax record. Mercer Family Holding Trust. I closed my eyes. "Mum," she asked, "are you there?" "Yes." "You need anything else?" I almost said no. Then I asked the question that had been pressing on my chest since the night before. "How long has that property been in that name?" Another pause. "Looks like just under 19 years. 19 years. 19 years meant Daniel had been in college. It meant Harold and I had still been paying off the second car. It meant my mother had still been alive, still calling every Sunday after church to ask if Harold was treating me right. 19 years meant this was no impulsive act made in fear at the end of life. This was architecture. Deliberate, patient architecture, laid beam by beam beneath our marriage, while I folded laundry and packed lunches, and thought the future, however modest, was shared. I thanked the woman and hung up. Then I called Daniel. He answered on the third ring, already distracted. I could hear machinery in the background at the shop. "Hey, Mama, you okay?" "No," I said. "Come by tonight." A pause. "What happened?" "I found something." He went quiet in the way people do when they already know what the something might be. "I can't leave right now," he said. "Can it wait?" "No." He exhaled into the phone. "I'll come after work." When I hung up, I stood very still in the kitchen, my hand around the receiver. That one hesitation had told me more than his words. The rest of the day I spent in motion, because motion felt safer than stillness. I stripped the funeral flowers from their wrapping and threw away the ones already turning slimy in the vase. I ran a load of towels. I wiped down the counter where Francine had set her peach pie, as if I could erase the memory of her standing there. I took out the trash and found myself glaring at Harold's old work boots by the back door. Mud dried in the seams, laces stiff with age. Then I went back to the papers. Once you stop assuming order means honesty, documents begin to look different. I pulled tax returns from the last 20 years and laid them side by side. Harold had always filed jointly, or at least that was what he told me. My signature was on some pages and missing from others. There were years when he had said, "I signed for you, honey, you were asleep," and I had barely looked up from the television. Years when I trusted the shorthand of marriage more than the legal shape of it. I found maintenance charges I did not recognize, a utility payment to an account in that other county, insurance premiums with property codes instead of descriptions. Some were small enough to disappear inside a monthly budget if you were not studying line by line. Harold had relied on that, not on dramatic theft, on small habits of male authority and female trust. At noon, I opened the locked metal box again and checked the documents more carefully. Tucked beneath our birth certificates and Daniel's baby immunization records was a small brass key with a faded blue tag attached. No label, no explanation. Just a key I had never seen before in a house where I thought I knew every drawer. I held it in my palm and felt a strange little chill. I was not yet certain it belonged to that property, but I knew it belonged to something Harold had chosen to keep away from me. I slipped it into my cardigan pocket. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, in the deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. My body felt heavy and hollow at once. I heated soup from one of the church casseroles and could not swallow more than 3 bites. The clock over the stove moved towards 6. Headlights crossed the front curtains. Daniel came in without knocking, carrying the smell of motor oil and cold air. He looked tired. More than tired. Cornered. "Where's Tessa?" I asked. "Home, with the girls." I nodded toward the dining room. "Sit." He sat. Not across from me, but one chair down, like a man trying to lower the temperature of a hard conversation before it starts. I laid the slip of paper on the table between us. Then the printout I'd written down from the county office. Then the brass key. His eyes went first to the address, then away. There it was. "What do you know?" I asked. Daniel rubbed his jaw. "Mama, no." My voice was quiet, which made him look up. "Do not start with that tone. Not tonight. Tell me what you know." He stared at the papers for a long time. Then he leaned back and looked at the ceiling the way he did as a boy when he was deciding how much trouble he was in. "I knew there was a property," he said finally. "I didn't know everything." The words hit with a kind of heat. Not surprise now. Confirmation. "How long?" "A few years." "A few years," I repeated. "Your father hid a property from me for 19 years, and you've known for a few years." He ran a hand over his mouth. "It wasn't like that." My laugh this time had no humour in it. "Then explain to me what it was like." He told me it was an investment. "For whom?" He hesitated. "For family." I looked at him until his face changed under my stare. I saw the little boy in him for one brief second. The child who used to break things by accident and stand with his shoulders up around his ears, hoping tenderness would spare him the full consequence. "Am I not family?" I asked. "That's not what I meant." "Then say what you meant." He pulled at his wedding band. There it was again, that same nervous habit from the funeral day. "Dad said the house was separate, protected." "Protected from what?" He did not answer. I leaned forward. "From what, Daniel?" He swallowed. "From spending, from medical debt, from taxes, from things happening." "Things happening," I said softly. "Do you hear yourself?" His face tightened. "I'm trying." "No, you're managing me. The way he managed me. And I am too old to be managed by my own child." That landed. I saw it in his eyes. He looked down at the table and spoke more quietly. He said if anything happened to him, there needed to be something no one could touch. "No one," I said. "Or me." He closed his eyes. That was answer enough. For a moment I could not speak. I looked at my son's hands on the table, broad and familiar, hands I had held when he crossed parking lots, hands I had kissed when fever made him cry as a boy. And I felt a grief so sharp it was almost clean. Not for Harold now. For the years in which mothering had taught me to excuse silence in men as seriousness, evasion as burden, control as responsibility. "When were you planning to tell me?" I asked. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Dad said not to, unless it became necessary." "And who decided necessary?" He said nothing. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, because sitting there another minute felt dangerous. I gripped the counter and stared at the dark reflection in the window over the sink. I could hear Daniel behind me shift in his chair, hear the soft creak of wood, the tiny sounds of a grown man waiting for mercy. I did not turn around. "Did Francine know?" A long pause. Then, "Yes." I laughed again, but this time it broke halfway through and turned into something rougher. "Of course she did." "Mama, it wasn't meant to hurt you." That sentence made me turn. He looked sincere. That was the worst part. sincere in the way protected people often are when they describe harm designed for someone else. "Not meant to hurt me," I said. "Daniel, your father died, and I found out the checking account was nearly empty. I learned my name was not where I thought it was. I found a trust I had never heard of. Your aunt speaks to me like I should be grateful for ignorance, and now you're standing in my kitchen telling me secrecy wasn't meant to hurt me." His mouth opened, then closed. "I buried my husband," I said, feeling my voice shake at last. "And then I learned all of you expected me to live on instructions." He stood up. "That's not fair." I stared at him. "You want to talk to me about fair?" His face reddened. "Dad said you worried. He said if you knew every detail, you'd get anxious and start imagining worst-case things." I stepped closer. "I am living the worst-case thing." Silence. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice. In the house next door, somebody closed a car door hard enough to echo. Daniel sank back into the chair and covered his face with one hand. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. He said he was trying to make sure there'd always be something in the family. The family. I thought of all the meals I had cooked, all the birthdays I had arranged, all the school forms I had signed, all the little economies I had practiced without praise. Buying cheaper detergent, mending hems, reusing containers, waiting another year before replacing the den carpet. Women like me spend a lifetime being told we are the keepers of family, only to discover that when money becomes concrete, family suddenly means a room full of people, and somehow not the wife. "Did he mean you?" I asked. Daniel did not answer fast enough. That was answer enough too. I went back to the dining room table and sat down because my legs had started to feel uncertain. I folded the slip of paper once, then once again, very neatly. "What else do you know?" I asked. "There's a house there." I looked up. His eyes moved to the key. "Dad took me out there once, maybe twice." "And?" "It's small, older place. Needed work. He said it was being kept for later." "Later when?" "I don't know." I believed that part. Not because Daniel was suddenly honest, but because men raised inside secrecy are often trusted with only fragments. Enough to serve the plan, not enough to question it. "Did he ever say why I was not told?" Daniel stared at the wood grain of the table. He said some things are easier if fewer people are involved." The words settled over me like something dirty. Fewer people. After 40 years of marriage, that was what I had been reduced to in the language of his planning. An extra person, a complication, a variable to manage. I reached for the water glass near my elbow and realised my hand was shaking so hard, the ice clicked against the sides. Daniel noticed and stood halfway again, but I lifted my free hand to stop him. "Sit down," I said. He sat. I took one careful sip and set the glass back on the table. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "If he meant that house for you, then why empty the account now? Why 10 days before he died?" Daniel's forehead tightened. "I don't know." I watched him. He looked away. "Try again." His jaw worked once. He knew he was worse than he was saying. I waited. "He met with Francine." "About what?" "I don't know all of it." "Daniel." He shut his eyes briefly. "About making sure things were where he wanted them." "And where did he want them?" There it was again, that hesitation, that tiny betrayal of the face before the mouth catches up. "Not with me," I said before he could answer. "That much is clear." He whispered, "Mama." "No, let that word rest. You don't get to soften this with mama." He looked like he might cry then. And a year earlier, that would have undone me. But there are moments when a woman finally sees the emotional patterns that have ruled a family for decades. Men conceal, women cushion. Sons apologize for fathers without actually correcting them. Sisters defend brothers and call it loyalty. Wives absorb the confusion because keeping peace has been mistaken for virtue for so long, nobody remembers when that bargain began. I looked at Daniel and saw Harold's training in him. Not cruelty exactly, just inherited permission. Here is what's going to happen, I said. Tomorrow I am driving to that address. He sat up straight. No, don't do that alone. Then you can come. He opened his mouth, but I kept going. And before we leave, I want every single thing you know written down. Dates, conversations, names. If Francine was involved in moving money, I want that written down too. She'll deny it. Maybe, but liars make mistakes when they're forced to repeat themselves. He stared at me like he had never heard me speak this way before. Perhaps he had not. Marriage changes a woman's voice in rooms where she has long chosen peace over precision. Widowhood, I was learning, changes it back. He left a little after 8, with shoulders bowed and eyes older than when he came in. At the door he turned, as if he wanted to say something that might still place him safely in the role of good son. I was going to tell you, eventually. I stood in the hallway beneath the dim yellow light and looked at him for a long moment. Eventually, I said, is just another word men use when women are meant to wait. After he left, I locked the door and checked the windows one by one. Not because I was afraid someone would come in, but because I needed to feel the shape of the house around me. I moved through each room slowly. Our bedroom with Harold's side still untouched. The den with his recliner angled towards the television. The bathroom drawer with his razor and aspirin, and the little pair of folding scissors he used to trim loose threads from his collars. I was looking at everything differently now. Not because the objects had changed, but because their meaning had. At the bedroom closet, I knelt and reached behind the stack of old shoeboxes on the lower shelf. Harold used to keep things back there he did not want Daniel to find when he was a teenager. Christmas gifts, hunting licenses. Once, years ago, a carton of cigarettes during the brief month he claimed he had only started back socially. My hand brushed a canvas pouch. I pulled it out. Inside were 2 old keys, a folded insurance card for the property in the other county, and a receipt from a hardware store near that same address, dated only 6 months earlier. Paint, replacement lock set, porch screws, cork. I sat back on my heels with the receipt in my hand. 6 months earlier. While he was still coming home to me, still asking whether we had enough mayonnaise, still complaining that his shoulder hurt when rain was coming, he had been maintaining that place. Not merely preserving some forgotten asset, maintaining it, visiting it, spending money and attention there, while I believed the only future we were preparing for was our shared old age in this house with the broken porch step and the overgrown azaleas. I laid the items out on the bedspread and looked at them under the lamp. The house had become real now, not just a line on a tax record, not just a secret folded into paper. A maintained house, a lock, fresh supplies, recent work, which meant somebody expected to use it. And as I sat there in the quiet, the ugliest thought of all finally came to me. It was not just that Harold had hidden a house, it was that he might have been preparing for a future in which I had no place in it at all. The next morning, Daniel was in my driveway before 8, sitting in his truck with both hands on the steering wheel, as if he were bracing for impact. The air had that damp, grey chill Georgia gets before rain, and the sky looked low enough to press on the rooftops. I stood at the front window for a moment, watching him through the curtain, letting him wait. It was not pettiness. It was the simple need, after days of being kept outside my own life, to let someone else feel the discomfort of not being admitted immediately. When I finally opened the door, he climbed out and reached for a manila envelope on the passenger seat. "I wrote down what I remembered," he said. I took it without answering. Inside were 3 pages in his uneven print. Dates or approximations of dates. Mentions of Harold taking him to the property around late summer, maybe 4 years ago. Notes about conversations in the garage, in hospital waiting rooms, once in the parking lot outside Cracker Barrel after church. Little details he had likely not intended to remember, but had stored anyway. Dad said keep it quiet for now. Aunt Francine knows the lawyer. Dad said Mama worries too much. Dad said there has to be something safe. Dad said don't bring it up unless things get complicated. Things get complicated. Men say that as though complication is some weather event, not the consequence of lies ripening. I folded the pages and slid them back into the envelope. "You're driving?" He nodded. The town on the address was the kind of place you can pass through without noticing if you are not from there. A courthouse square with brick storefronts, 2 churches facing each other from opposite corners, a diner with a striped awning, a feed store, 3 vacant buildings with sun-faded signs from businesses that no longer existed. We left the main road after town and turned onto a narrower county route lined with pine, scrub brush, and old mailboxes leaning at tired angles. I watched the numbers on the boxes as we passed. My heart was not pounding the way I thought it would. It felt worse than that. Too calm, as if some older part of me had already accepted the truth and was simply waiting for the rest of my body to catch up. Daniel slowed. "I think it's up here." The house appeared around a bend, half hidden by pecan trees and a sagging stretch of fence. It was smaller than I had imagined, a 1-story place with pale yellow siding gone chalky with age, and a green metal roof streaked dark from old rain. There was a porch across the front, 2 rocking chairs pushed to one side, and a row of camellias planted along the walk. Not wild, maintained. Somebody had weeded those beds recently. Somebody had swept the porch. For a moment, all I could do was stare. Harold had hidden a house. And the first thing that broke me was not the deception, it was the care. The porch chairs, the clean windows, the fresh cork along the frame of the front door, exactly matching the receipt I had found. Those details told me this was not some neglected asset buried in paperwork. This place had been tended, thought about, prepared. Daniel cut the engine. Neither of us moved. "Did you ever come inside?" I asked. He looked straight ahead. "Once." I turned toward him slowly. "And you still sat at my table and let me ask questions like I was guessing in the dark?" He swallowed. "I know." That was all he had now. "I know, I'm sorry," Dad said. Francine knew, the thin language of a man arriving late to his own conscience. I opened the truck door and stepped out. The gravel crunched under my shoes. Somewhere behind the house, a dog barked once and fell silent. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine straw. Up close, the place looked even more lived in than it had from the road. Not occupied daily, perhaps, but watched over. A broom leaned beside the porch steps, a coiled hose hung neatly on a hook. There was a ceramic planter by the door with dead winter mums still standing upright in the soil. I climbed the steps and took the brass key from my pocket. My hand shook only once, right before I put it in the lock. It fit. Of course it fit. Inside, the house was cool and dim and heartbreakingly ordinary. A small living room with a brown sofa, 2 lamps, a braided rug, and a television in the corner. A bookshelf with old paperbacks. A kitchen with white cabinets and clean counters, and a tin of tea bags beside the kettle. On the wall above the sink hung a framed print of wildflowers, the kind of bland, pleasant thing Harold used to call good enough for a spare room. But this was not a spare room. This was a life arranged in miniature. I walked farther in. My shoes sounded too loud on the floor. There was a hallway with 2 bedrooms and 1 bath. The first bedroom held a double bed with a quilt folded smooth across it, a chest of drawers, and a closet with men's shirts hanging inside. Harold's size, Harold's style. Plaid work shirts, a navy windbreaker, 2 pairs of slacks, a box of shoe polish on the shelf. I reached out and touched one sleeve with my fingertips. Freshly washed. Not brand new, not forgotten. Freshly washed. Daniel had stayed in the doorway, as if he understood he no longer belonged at the centre of this discovery. "Mama?" I raised my hand for silence. In the second bedroom, there was a twin bed, a little writing desk, and a cedar chest at the foot of the mattress. No clothes in the closet, no photos, no signs of a second permanent resident, just a room waiting to become whatever someone decided it would be. And there, sitting on the desk under the window, was a legal pad in Harold's handwriting. I knew his handwriting so well I could have recognised it in a fire. I picked up the pad. Most of it was practical. Lists, door seal, change air filter, call Eddie about roof flashing, bring old tax file from home. There was something so brutally normal about it that for a second I nearly laughed. Men are capable of constructing entire secret lives and still writing them down like errands. Then I turned the page. What I saw was not a confession. Men like Harold rarely leave those. It was worse. It was a plan. Transfer after release. Meet F. Get trust papers signed. Daniel to have access. Elaine not good with details. Keep it simple when time comes. I sat down in the chair because my knees gave out. Elaine not good with details. 40 years. 40 years of cooking, mending, saving, sitting up through illnesses, driving him to appointments, rubbing his back through pain, and in the private shorthand of his own planning, that was me. Not good with details. As if I were a child who misplaced receipts. As if all the details I had carried for our family did not count, because they lived in my hands instead of on his forms. I heard Daniel take one step into the room, then stop again. "Did you know he wrote this?" I asked. No. I believed him this time. Not because I trusted him fully, but because shock has its own posture, and he had it. I read the lines again. Meet F. Francine. Daniel to have access. Keep it simple when time comes. Simple for whom? I kept turning pages, more notes. A reminder to review something with M. Reddick. A phone number. Another page with amounts written in columns, arrows between them, abbreviations I did not yet understand. Then one sentence, standing alone near the bottom of the page, as if it had been added later. If she asks, say investment property. I put the pad down very carefully. It is a terrible thing to watch grief harden into knowledge. You can almost feel it happen inside your own body. The softness drains out first, then the pleading, then the part of you still trying to rescue the dead person from the truth. By the time I stood up, I was no longer looking for an explanation that would allow me to keep loving Harold in the same clean way I had before he died. That version of him was already gone. Perhaps it had never existed. I walked back to the living room. On the far wall beside the bookshelf was a narrow cabinet with a key already in the lock. Inside were folders, insurance documents, tax notices, utility statements, a copy of the trust papers, deed transfers, a file tab labelled Beneficiary Access. The world narrowed to paper. I took the trust file first. Mercer Family Holding Trust, created 19 years earlier. Trustee, Harold Mercer. Successor, co-administrator upon death or incapacity, Francine Ellis. Secondary access authorization, Daniel Mercer. Property beneficiary designation attached by instruction. There was my name exactly nowhere on the first 2 pages. I stood there flipping through document after document with the peculiar numbness of someone opening letters addressed to a stranger and slowly realizing that stranger is supposed to be her. By the third page, it became clear what Harold had done. The trust did not merely hold the property, it was designed to bypass me. The wording was careful, almost elegant in its avoidance. A residence held for family continuity and protected distribution. Asset management in event of medical or personal vulnerability. Discretionary release to named parties. Francine and Daniel were not accidental names added at the last minute. They were structural. This had not been a panic move during an illness. It had been built over decades and updated as needed. Then I found the amendment from 8 months earlier. Harold had met with a lawyer, revised access terms, and authorised release of the property and related funds directly to Daniel, with Francine assisting administration, in order to ensure continuity and prevent confusion during bereavement. Prevent confusion. The cruelty of bureaucratic language is that it allows betrayal to look like prudence. I heard myself make a sound then, something between a laugh and a gasp. I had to put a hand against the cabinet to steady myself. Daniel came closer. "What is it?" I handed him the page. He read it, and the colour drained from his face. "I didn't know about this version." "You knew enough." He stared at the paper. "I swear to you, I didn't know it was written like this." I watched him read his own benefit into existence. "Did you think he meant to give me control later?" he asked, almost to himself. "No," I said. "I think you hoped that if you didn't ask too many questions, you could still think of yourself as a good son." That landed harder than anything else I had said. He sat down heavily on the sofa. "I never asked him to cut you out." "No, you just accepted being placed ahead of me." He looked up at me then, wounded in a way that might once have softened me. But truth has a ruthless clarity. Wounded people can still be complicit. Sad sons can still participate in their mother's humiliation. I kept searching. In the bottom drawer of the cabinet was a folder marked Household. Inside were receipts for groceries, plumbing work, electric bills, and one paid invoice for a local woman who had apparently cleaned the house twice a month for the last year. Not an affair then. No second wife. No hidden child. In some ways, that might have been easier to understand. Instead, what Harold had hidden here was stranger, and to me, somehow colder. He had built a place of escape and control. A place where resources were preserved without me. A place where his sister and son could step in around my absence and call it responsibility. Then I found a single handwritten note clipped to the cleaner's invoices. "Please wash sheets in both rooms if staying over." Both rooms. I read it 3 times before the meaning settled. Staying over. Not just visiting for repairs, not stopping by. Sleeping here. My husband had spent nights in this house while telling me he was away for supplier meetings, or helping Daniel at the shop late, or too tired to drive back after fishing with old friends. I did not know how many. I did not know whether Francine ever came out here, or whether he sat alone in that chair, drinking coffee and enjoying the pleasure of a place where I did not exist. But the fact itself was enough. He had not only arranged for a future without me in it, he had rehearsed it. I sat down opposite Daniel, the note in my hand. He stayed here. Daniel looked at me blankly at first, then at the paper. I watched comprehension move across his face like a shadow. "Oh God," he said. "Yes," I answered. "Now you're close." He covered his mouth. The room went silent again. Not the soft silence of companionship. The stripped silence that follows when pretense collapses and everyone is left standing in the draft. After a while, he said, "I thought it was just a place. I thought it was about money. It was about power." He looked at me. "Money is never just money when one person controls what another person knows," I said. "It is power. It is permission. It is deciding who gets steadiness and who gets dependency, and then calling that love. I do not know where those words came from. Perhaps from every older woman I had ever watched smile at a table while men discussed assets over her head. Perhaps from my own mother, who never once questioned my father's decisions until after his stroke, when she found out he had taken out loans she knew nothing about. At the time, she had only said, with exhausted wonder, "I did not realise how expensive trust could be." I understood her then in a way I had not as a younger woman. Daniel looked around the room as if seeing it properly for the first time. What do we do? We. There was a time when that word would have comforted me. In that house, it almost offended me. "I do not know what you're doing," I said. "I know what I am doing." I took out my phone and photographed everything. The notes, the trust documents, the amendment, the bills, the cleaner's invoices, the cabinet, the closets. Every ordinary proof that this secret had been lived in, funded, maintained, and protected. Then I called the number written on the notepad beside M. Reddick. A man answered on the fourth ring. Older voice, cautious. "Mr. Reddick," I said, "my name is Elaine Mercer. I am Harold Mercer's widow." Silence. "I believe you handled legal work connected to a property in Dooley County." Longer silence. "I can't discuss client matters," he said at last. "You may be more willing once you hear that I am standing inside the property with documents naming my deceased husband, my sister-in-law, and my son, in an arrangement designed to leave me uninformed. I am taking photographs. I will be retaining counsel. And if there is any question of coercion, omission, or inappropriate transfer during illness, I intend to ask it." Still silence. Then, "Mrs. Mercer, I think it would be best if you had your attorney contact my office." There it was, the first crack of professional fear. "Thank you," I said, and hung up. Daniel was staring at me. "You already knew this house existed," I said. "So hear me carefully now. Your father is dead, but the decisions he made are still alive on paper. I will not be quiet to protect his memory, and I will not be gentle to protect anyone's comfort." He nodded slowly. "And Francine?" he asked. I looked toward the kitchen, toward the clean counters and tea tin, and the life of managed omission Harold had built inside these walls. "Francine has had far too easy a week," I said. We stayed another hour, gathering what I could legally take without risking some later claim that I had interfered. I brought the copied trust amendment, the legal pad, the insurance records, and the maintenance receipts. I left the originals where they were after photographing them, because I had no intention of behaving in a way that could be used against me. Men like Harold spend years assuming their wives are too emotional for details. One of the great pleasures of betrayal is eventually proving how well you can handle details when you are finally forced to. On the drive back, Daniel kept glancing at me as though he expected me to break apart in the passenger seat. Instead, I was oddly steady. Pain was there, yes. Tremendous pain. But the confusion had thinned. Confusion is the most exhausting part. Once the truth becomes visible, even an ugly truth, the body finds a different kind of strength. Halfway home, my phone rang. Francine. I answered on speaker and held the phone between us. "Where are you?" she asked without greeting. I almost admired the nerve of it. "Out," I said. "Daniel's truck isn't at the shop." I looked at him. He stared ahead, jaw tight. "You seem very informed about everyone's movements," I said. "I called because Mr. Reddick's office called me." There it was. I let silence sit on the line just long enough to make her hear herself breathing. "Then I suppose you know where I've been," I said. Her tone sharpened. "Elaine, you had no business going there without speaking to me first." I closed my eyes for 1 second and then opened them. "My husband hid a property from me for 19 years, And you think I needed your permission to open the front door? It's not that simple. No, I said, staring through the windshield at the road unspooling ahead of us. It's actually much simpler than you keep pretending. You knew. Daniel knew. Harold arranged things so I would be the last person told, if I was told at all. And now that I have the documents, you're frightened. She inhaled sharply. You don't understand what Harold wanted. That sentence, more than anything, lit something cold and final in me. I understand exactly what Harold wanted, I said. He wanted me managed. On the other end, she said nothing. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. I continued, every word measured. You may tell anyone you like that I am emotional, unstable, confused, grieving, dramatic, or difficult. Women are called those names every day when they finally begin reading the paperwork men hoped they never would. But hear me very clearly, Francine. I have seen the trust. I have seen the amendment. I have seen the notes. And by tomorrow, my attorney will too. She tried one last angle, that brittle moral authority she wore like perfume. Do you really want to drag Harold's name through the mud? I looked out at the roadside fields, brown and flat beneath the grey sky. No, I said. Harold did that himself. Then I ended the call, and for the first time since the funeral, the truth was no longer just something I knew. It was something I was prepared to say out loud. The next morning, I sat in a lawyer's office with Harold's notes spread between us, and for the first time since his funeral, someone looked at the papers and did not ask me how I felt before asking what had been done. Her name was Cynthia Bell, and she was a widow herself, though I did not learn that until much later. At first, I only noticed the way she read. No sighing, no little sympathetic head tilt, no softening the language for my sake. She read every page with a yellow pencil in her hand, underlining clauses, circling names, drawing arrows in the margins as if she were clearing brush from a path. When she finally looked up, she took off her glasses and said, "Your husband worked very carefully." I sat straighter in the chair. Carefully legal or carefully cruel? The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. Sometimes those overlap. Daniel was beside me, quieter than I had ever seen him. He had offered to wait outside, but I told him to stay. If he wanted to understand what this family had become, he could hear it in full daylight. Cynthia tapped the amendment with her pencil. The trust itself exists, the property exists. Some of this may be difficult to unwind fully if title and beneficiary language were executed cleanly, but that does not mean everything about the administration of it was proper. And it certainly does not mean you have no standing. Because I'm his wife. Because you are his widow. Because marital assets may have supported maintenance. Because transfers close to death deserve scrutiny. Because omissions matter. And because people who overplan secrecy often get careless. Somewhere. Careless somewhere. I thought of Harold's note. Elaine not good with details. The irony almost made me smile. Cynthia asked me questions for nearly an hour. Dates, bank balances, the transfer timing, Harold's illness, whether he had been medicated when he signed the amendment, whether I had ever been informed of the trust, whether household funds had covered the utility and maintenance charges for the hidden house, whether I had reason to believe others influenced him near the end. I answered everything as clearly as I could. Then she turned to Daniel. When did you first become aware of the property? He swallowed and told the truth. Not elegantly, not proudly, but he told it. I watched shame work through him one sentence at a time, and though it did not repair anything, I will say this for him. He did not lie again once he understood the cost of continuing. Cynthia wrote for a while, then said, I want account records, tax returns, utility histories. I want a timeline of every known conversation involving your aunt. And I want formal notice sent before anyone starts moving assets or changing locks." At that, Daniel looked up. "Changing locks?" She gave him a cool glance. People do odd things when they realize a quiet arrangement is about to become a public question. Public. There was the word I had not let myself think too much about. Until then, the betrayal still felt trapped inside family language. Harold, Francine, Daniel, trust, house. But once a lawyer put it in procedural terms, it crossed a threshold. It was no longer just emotional truth. It was a matter that would leave the privacy of our dining room and move into offices, bank counters, church conversations, forwarded phone calls, and the small town grapevine that feeds on secrecy the way fire feeds on dry wood. When we left Cynthia's office, rain had started. Fine, cold rain that silvered the windshield and blurred the parking lot into soft shapes. Daniel stood beside his truck with his hands in his pockets. "I'll do whatever she asks," he said. I looked at him. He looked older in that rain. "That would have meant more a week ago," I said. He nodded. "I know." I had heard those two words so often by then they had almost lost meaning. But this time, something in his face was less defensive, less eager to remain a good man in his own mind. He was beginning, slowly, to understand that regret without cost is just self-pity in a nicer coat. Over the next several days, the matter spread exactly the way Cynthia predicted. Quietly first, then all at once. A formal letter went to Francine and to Mr. Reddick's office. The bank received notice requesting records connected to the transfer. The county office was contacted for filing copies and tax history. Cynthia found that property taxes, repairs, insurance, and utilities had been paid for years from accounts funded by income Harold and I would, by any ordinary marriage, have considered shared money. That was one line of argument. The other line was uglier. The amendment had been executed while Harold was already in visible decline, during a period when he had been in and out of appointments, taking medications that affected concentration, and leaning more heavily than ever on Francine to help with paperwork. I had not known how much she was helping, or directing, or standing nearby while his old instinct for control turned brittle and mean in the face of dying. Cynthia never promised me a dramatic courtroom victory. She was too honest for that. What she promised was pressure, documentation, exposure to the right people in the right order. And sometimes that is what justice looks like. Not a speech, not a slammed gavel. Pressure applied where secrecy once lived comfortably. Francine called me twice that week. I did not answer either time. Then she came to the house. I was in the front room folding towels when I heard her knock. Not her usual tap and enter rhythm, a real knock this time. Amazing what legal correspondence can do for a person's respect for boundaries. When I opened the door, she was standing in a navy raincoat with her purse clutched under one arm and indignation arranged across her face like makeup. "We need to talk," she said. "No," I said. Her eyes flashed. "Don't be childish." I almost laughed. Women are called childish so quickly when we stop cooperating with their preferred version of events. "We are not talking in my doorway," I said. "If you have something to say, you can say it with counsel present." She lowered her voice, trying for reason. "Elaine, this is getting blown out of proportion." I looked at her for a long moment. Out of proportion compared to what? Compared to secretly managing my husband's hidden property for years? Compared to helping move money before he died? Compared to letting me bury him before anyone told me the truth? Her mouth tightened. "You are making this sound dirty." "It is dirty." "No, it was practical." She stepped closer. "Harold was worried about you." That old sentence again. So polished. So insulting. "Worried I would do what?" I asked. "Spend our own money on groceries? Outlive his instructions?" She exhaled sharply. "You always were emotional about money." I felt something in me go very still. I was careful about money, I said. There is a difference. You just never learned it because careful women don't look powerful to people like you. She stared at me. I continued before she could recover. Tell me something, Francine. When my husband sat with you and planned a life in which I would know less than his sister, did you feel proud? Important? Useful? Did it make you feel chosen? The words landed. She went pale beneath her powder. You don't know what you're talking about. No, I said. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I have known women like you all my life. Women who stand beside controlling men and call themselves practical because it is easier than admitting they enjoy being trusted more than the wife. Her chin trembled then, just once. Anger, not sorrow. You think you were some perfect spouse, she snapped. Harold needed peace. He needed someone who could think clearly. That told me more than all her denials had. I stepped outside and pulled the front door mostly closed behind me. Rain dotted the porch rail. The air smelled like wet mulch and cold earth. Peace, I said softly. Is that what you call silence when it benefits you? She folded her arms. I am done being spoken to this way. Then go home. She looked stunned, as though 40 years of my politeness had convinced her I had forgotten how to end a conversation. You can't shut me out, she said. I held her gaze. Watch me. Then I stepped back inside and closed the door. My hands were shaking afterward, but not from fear, more from release. There is a great deal of trembling stored in a woman who has spent decades swallowing what would be simpler to say aloud. The community learned in layers, not because I announced it from the pulpit or stood up at Sunday supper with a stack of legal papers, but because secrets unravel through ordinary channels. A clerk tells a cousin tells a sister. Mr. Reddick's office becomes unusually cautious with the wrong person on the phone. A banker recognizes a name. A son stops defending a father as confidently as he once did. By the second week, women at church had begun pausing a little too long after asking how I was holding up. One afternoon, Mrs. Colton from down the street arrived with banana bread and the careful face of someone bringing both comfort and information. I ran into Paula at the county office, she said once we were seated. She mentioned there's been some confusion over property filings connected to Harold. The sentence was delicate. Southern women can wrap dynamite in lace if given enough practice. I poured tea. There was a property I did not know existed. Mrs. Colton set down her cup very slowly. There are moments when a woman must decide whether to protect the image of the dead man who wronged her, or protect herself. For days I had been making that decision in pieces, with Cynthia, with Daniel, with Francine at the door. Sitting with Mrs. Colton, I made it cleanly. He kept it hidden, I said, and others helped. Mrs. Colton's expression changed, not to gossip exactly, to recognition. She was 70 if she was a day, and suddenly I had the strong suspicion I was not the first wife she had seen blindsided by paperwork after a funeral. She patted my wrist once. Then tell the truth plainly, Elaine. Let people do with it what they will. That advice did more for me than sympathy ever could have. So I told the truth plainly. Not to everyone, not performatively. But when asked, I stopped smoothing the story into something gentler than it was. Harold had hidden a house. Harold had used marital funds to maintain it. Harold had structured access through Francine and Daniel, while leaving me uninformed. Harold had transferred money close to his death. Harold had made arrangements for a future in which his wife knew the least and depended the most. The effect was not dramatic in a single moment. It was cumulative. At church, two men who had admired Harold's good head for planning stopped speaking quite so confidently when they saw me. One woman told me in the fellowship hall, "I always wondered why Francine acted like she had a key to your marriage." Another quietly mentioned that Harold had once been seen at a hardware store near that county road on a weekday when he had supposedly been helping Daniel at the shop. Truth attracts other truths. Once one person stops pretending, the room changes. Daniel's part in the consequence unfolded more privately. He came by often then, more often than before Harold died, which told its own sad story. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he fixed things I had not asked him to fix. A cabinet hinge, the porch step, the bathroom faucet. Useful work, but there was penitence in it. He had finally realised that helping after harm does not erase the harm. It only proves you understood, too late, what help should have looked like all along. One evening, after repairing the loose kitchen drawer his father had ignored for years, he stood with a screwdriver in his hand and said, "Tessa knows everything now." I dried a plate slowly. "And?" She asked me what kind of man lets his mother get treated like paperwork. I looked at him then. He did not look away. "That was a hard question," he said. "Yes," I replied. "It should be." He set the screwdriver down. "I was raised to think Dad always had a reason." I nodded once. "Many men are," he swallowed. "I'm trying to see what I missed." I put the plate in the cabinet. "You did not miss it, Daniel. You accepted it. That is harder to admit, but it is the truth." He closed his eyes briefly. "I know." This time, the words held. Cynthia's pressure did what she said it would do. Not all at once, and not perfectly, but enough. Bank records showed the transfer had moved into an account linked to the trust administration. Utility histories tied regular household expenses at the hidden house to funds that had originated from shared marital income. Questions about Harold's mental clarity near the amendment period made Mr. Reddick deeply eager to avoid formal escalation. Francine, suddenly stripped of moral confidence, became cautious in writing and evasive in calls. Under negotiation, portions of the transferred funds were frozen from immediate distribution. Control over the house itself became contested rather than assumed. It was not a miracle. It was not total victory. But it changed the balance. For the first time since the funeral, no one was speaking as if my exclusion were a settled fact. When Cynthia called to explain the latest proposal, I sat at the kitchen table with the afternoon sun warming the edge of the wood. "They want resolution," she said. "Of course they do. There is an opening here, not because they've grown consciences, but because scrutiny makes people practical." I almost smiled. There was that word again. Practical. Such a useful little disguise. The final arrangement took another month. I received a financial settlement acknowledging marital contribution to the acquisition and maintenance of the property, along with direct protection from further discretionary control by Francine. The structure around the house itself had to be revised. Not wholly surrendered to me, no. Life is rarely that neat. But no longer hidden, no longer held in the same quiet chain of command, and no longer available as proof that my role in my own marriage had been ornamental. By the time the papers were signed, spring had begun to show itself in the yard. The azaleas out front were budding again. The mornings felt softer. Birds returned to the feeder Harold never remembered to refill unless I asked him twice. I drove out to the hidden house one last time alone. Not because I wanted it, not in the way people imagine wanting property. I did not stand on that porch thinking, "At last, mine." What I felt was stranger and more sober than that. I wanted to look at the place once with no lies around it, to see it in full daylight as what it truly was. Not a dream, not an investment, not a symbol of security. A choice. A long, quiet choice made by a man who preferred control over honesty. Inside, the rooms were as still as before. The sofa, the lamp, the tea tin. Harold's shirts were gone now, boxed for sorting. The legal pad had long since been copied and stored. Without his small habits in it, the place already felt less like a secret life and more like an empty stage after a difficult play. I stood in the second bedroom, the one with the twin bed and little desk, and I understood something that had taken me weeks to reach. The house had never really been the point, not in the deepest sense. The point was that for 40 years I had been taught, gently and steadily, to accept being loved without being fully informed, to call it stability, to call it trust, to call it a husband taking care of things. The house only made that lesson visible in wood and paper and locks. I opened the window over the desk and let spring air into the room. Then I closed it again and walked out. I did not keep the place for sentiment. I did not turn it into a shrine or a revenge monument or some dramatic symbol of my triumph. After the dust settled, I made the decision that suited my life, not Harold's secrets. The property was sold under the revised arrangement, and my portion of what came from it gave me something far more useful than vindication: breathing room. I paid off the small debts I had been quietly carrying. I replaced the porch step. I had the roof on my own house repaired before another season could threaten it. I opened an account in my own name and sat with the banker until I understood every page she placed in front of me. I asked questions without apology. I wrote down passwords myself. I bought a sturdy file box and labelled it in clear black marker with categories that made sense to me, not to a man who liked power hidden inside neat handwriting. Daniel kept coming by. Not every day, not too often, enough. One Saturday, he brought the girls to help plant herbs in the yard. I watched my granddaughters press basil and rosemary into the soil while arguing about worms, and something inside me loosened. Not healed completely. Healing is too pretty a word for what really happens. What happens is quieter. You discover you can laugh one afternoon without betraying your own pain. You notice the house no longer feels like a courtroom. You sleep 6 hours straight. You make soup because you want it, not because grief has left casseroles to use up. Tessa hugged me at the gate before they left. She held on longer than usual. "I'm glad you didn't let them make you small," she whispered. I stood there after their car pulled away, garden dirt under my nails, evening light lying warm across the porch, and I thought about how many women do get made small. Not all at once, not by obvious cruelty, by paperwork withheld, by assumptions inherited, by the tone people use when they say, "Don't worry your head about that," by love that asks for trust but does not return transparency. I still grieved Harold. That may be the hardest part for outsiders to understand. Betrayal does not erase every tenderness that came before it. I remembered his laugh when Daniel was born, the way he covered me with a blanket when I fell asleep in the den, the ridiculous vanilla pancakes, the hand on my back at my mother's funeral. Human beings are not tidy enough to become monsters just because they wrong us. Sometimes they are worse than monsters. Sometimes they are ordinary people who love you in some ways and diminish you in others, and you spend years calling that mixture marriage because you do not yet have another language for it. Now I do. And if you are listening to me tonight, I want to leave you with this. Love should never require your ignorance to survive. Peace should never depend on your silence. And if the people around you call secrecy protection, ask yourself who that protection is really for. Have you ever looked back on a relationship and realized the thing you called trust was really just not being told the truth?